Now we'll be talking about Han Lash's piece, Start. And the theme for our discussion of this piece is going to be how to develop color and nuance and pacing and structuring of a larger form in our playing on the snare drum. I wanted to work with Han because, on the one hand, I love their music. And on the other hand, I wanted to see what somebody who works so much with harmony and pitch would do with the snare drum, an instrument that we don't typically associate with melody or harmony. Like I said, I love Han's music. I think it has a relentless rhythmicity to it. It has a rich harmonic sensibility. It's clear, it's contrapuntal, it's rigorous, it's rhythmic, it's driving. At the same time, they're a virtuosic performer on the harp. And I think the harp and the snare drum are sort of kindred orchestral spirits. And I thought it would be fascinating to work with somebody who understands that somebody's going to have to play the piece. In terms of their music, I was inspired and sort of took sonic inspiration in approaching Start from a piece called C for vibraphone and piano, a piece called Prelude and Chorale, which is a really amazing percussion quartet, a piece called Music for Loss, a really terrifying orchestral work, and then a glockenspiel trio called Glockenliebe. And it's important to get a sense of a composer's style, especially when you're approaching a composer's work for the snare drum, because in this case, the text of the piece is not really enough information to develop a really compelling, nuanced, and also individualistic interpretation of the piece. We need to have a broad sense of a composer's style, and then we can bring that sense and that framing to bear in the text of the piece. It was really exciting to develop this piece with Han. I sent them a drum and discovered that they're really phenomenal at tuning the instrument. And we discovered that there are a lot of similarities between playing the harp and between playing the snare drum. In general, when you're in an orchestra, you're always thought of as sort of a single spice like turmeric or cardamom, something that has a very strong sensibility. And it's hard to sort of break out of that. At the same time, we talked a lot about the sort of paradox of playing the snare drum, especially an orchestral snare drum. The idea that you have so much technical control over your instrument and you're required to play at the extremes of your instrument. But sometimes you can be limited stylistically by our sort of pedagogical training and the way that composers and other performers conceptualize your instrument. And so I was excited when I got the piece Start in that it uses this concept of developing variation, something that we most associate with the music of Johannes Brahms, but sort of a long-term development of a rhythmic motive, and that it incorporates some things that they thought I was pretty good at on the snare drum, meaning playing really soft and playing with a whole bunch of different implements. Start is crisp, precise, dynamic, sharp, and uncompromising. The piece is based on a handful of motives, which are sort of continuously, obsessively, tenaciously, and explosively developed basically throughout the entire piece. And the performer highlights these themes with kind of dynamic elan, and is sort of aided and abetted by a variety of implements whose colors delineate the formal sections of the work. For Han, the features of the snare drum sound, which make it so challenging to play, its sort of brutally unforgiving sound, its sharp focus, its kind of dynamic range, are also pathways to highlight touch, finesse, and subtlety in one's playing. The piece never relaxes, and the jagged silences throughout the work are gradually eliminated in pursuit of a really breathless climax. So what makes a great interpretation of Start? In my opinion, a great interpretation of this piece highlights the form of the work and highlights the form with really compelling rhythmic nuance. A great performance of this piece is melodic. Han's music is at its core melodic and harmonic, and it's wonderful if a performer can bring that sensibility to this piece. A great performance has a really refined sense of color and timbre. The piece is basically the same thing over and over and over. So a great performer will figure out how to color it meaningfully over the course of the piece. At the same time, a great performance is relentless, but also flexible. And a great performer of this piece, I think, will approach learning the piece already with a mental representation in mind, an idea of what this piece could be like on the stage. I think as percussionists, we tend to approach music that is straight 16th notes assuming the intention of the composer is for us to play everything evenly. And when we see accents and non-accented notes, we approach that as sort of a texture that has two essential sounds. Looking at Hand's other music, we see the richness of color, harmony, and melody in their music. And I think it would be a shame not to bring that to a performance of this work. So what do we need in order to play Start? Well, we need a drum. And basically any snare drum will work for this piece. I like to use an orchestral snare drum, meaning one that has cable snares, because I like the crispness of it. This drum and the drum that's on the CD is a 5 by 14 inch pearl maple Philharmonic snare drum. I like the maple drum because it's warm and it doesn't have too aggressive of a sound. It can tolerate a whole bunch of different kinds of coloristic playing, and I can play it quite softly. In terms of a head, for this piece, I use a Remo Renaissance Diplomat head. I like that the drum head has a lot of pitch in it. I like to play with color and melody when I play the snare drum, and I like that this head kind of facilitates that. In terms of sticks, almost any snare drum stick will work for this piece. I use the Vic Firth Tim Jennis General stick for this piece, but you can experiment and see what works for you. You might even try using a smaller beaded stick for some parts of the piece and switch back and forth, depending on what suits your hands and what suits your playing. A lot of the playing in the front half of the piece is quite soft, so you might choose a stick that facilitates that. You're also going to need metal sticks, and I've tried triangle beaters, metal knitting needles, and I eventually settled upon these metal chopsticks. I like that they're weighted towards the back of the chopstick, which kind of facilitates playing pretty soft with them. And when we get to the metal stick part of the piece, we're going to be playing pretty soft. We're also going to need tiny wooden sticks, and I use these disposable, well, not disposable anymore, wood chopsticks. I also like that they're really, really, really light, and they provide a meaningful contrast with the concert snare drum sticks. We're also going to need brushes. I use these Vic Firth wire brushes. I like that the wires are stiff, and in the piece we're going to need real clarity of articulation with the brush. It's not a sort of jazz drumming kind of brush. So a brush that's really stiff and provides a lot of response, and especially facilitates rim shots, is really going to be helpful for us. Finally, we're going to need our hands in the piece, both our hands, our fingers, and our thumbs. One important thing to keep in mind with this is that the composer of the piece plays the harp, and people who play the harp tend to have very strong calluses on their hands. And so when Hand was writing this piece, their calluses are such that it creates a meaningful articulation on the snare drum. And so when we work to do the finger sections of the piece, we're going to have to emulate that a little bit in our playing. Okay, let's take a brief side quest to talk about mutes and practice pads when we play the snare drum. In my opinion, if you're really serious about having a wide range of expression when you play your instrument, you need to have access to a wide range of expressive tools when you practice your instrument. So I recommend for people learning snare drum or learning any kind of snare drum solo to spend some time practicing without a mute and without the snares. Playing without a mute and without the snares is like singing into a microphone after singing in the shower most of your life. It's very revealing with regard to the color of your playing, with regard to the evenness of your hands, and with regard to sort of your melodic and rhythmic inflection. And even if you play in a situation where your range of expression is this, I think when you practice, you need to practice with a really wide range of possibilities. So after we develop a sense of a composer's style, in my opinion, the best way to get to know a piece of music is to fall in love with some special moments. So now let's approach some of the special moments in this piece, Start. In many ways, Start is the most straightforward of the pieces in Unsnared Drum, but it gives us a lot of time and space to think about form and color and rhythmicity and melody in our playing. All right, the first section we're going to talk about in Start is the very beginning of the piece. I think here, as performers, we need to start by figuring out a range of expression. And that means thinking about a lot of different parameters of our playing, isolating them, and thinking about how we can pace the piece. So the piece begins very softly with this rhythmic motive, right? This 5/4 motive. Bum, 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 bum. And so we need to find a way of playing that denotes that the piece is going to traverse a really long journey. So first, let's think about some of the things we can adjust when we play the snare drum. So true to form, I'm taking the mute off and I'm turning the snares off. First, let's just think about color. So here at the beginning of the piece, I like to play close to the edge of the drum. One, it facilitates playing softly, and at the same time, it provides a crispness that I think really helps propel the music forward. Now let's think about grip pressure or how much we're holding the stick. So by the end of the piece, we're going to be playing really aggressively, but I think at the beginning, we could be a little bit more nuanced and suave. So instead of a stroke where we're really propelling the stick, what about something where we're dropping? Versus this. I kind of like the subtlety of it, knowing that we have a long journey ahead of us. Okay, the next thing to think about is the accents. How are we going to inflect these accents? If we play the accents really strong and the other notes really weak, that's cool, but does it sound like it's in 4/4? One thing to think about also is the distance between the accents and the unaccented notes. And I think it's important for us as percussionists to develop a sense of nuance and inflection there. So maybe at the beginning of the piece, the accents could be a little bit closer to the unaccented notes than at the end of the piece. So let's try to work on that a little bit. So at the beginning, let's just try to get the 16th notes going. Here, I'm just playing all over the head. I'm experimenting with putting the stick in different parts of my hand to try to find something that I think highlights my mental representation of this piece, which is that it should be kind of distant and a little bit more elusive. Then let's try to get a little bit of arm weight happening to facilitate these accents. So instead of accenting like this, what if we did something like this? Versus. Both work. I think here I would choose the one with the arm because it's a little bit, like I said, more subtle. So now let's try to pace the first page of the piece. So even though hand marks piano crescendo poco a poco, we do that, of course, but I think we can also do that with the color when we play. So maybe the beginning has kind of a distant, veiled sound. And then we sort of go from there. The final thing I would encourage you to think about here is rhythmicity. So rhythmicity is basically a term that implies, like, how do you play a rhythm? So on the one hand, you need a steady pulse to hear a rhythm against it. On the other hand, you need sort of an even subdivision of that pulse so that we have a frame of reference. But at the same time, we need sort of an inflection. It's very hard to listen to someone speak who speaks in a really flat monotone voice. So here at the beginning of the piece, as a performer, you might ask yourself, should I play this piece as though it's in 4/4, like chicka 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 chicka, and hear the accents against it? Or should I play the accents just as these points through the piece? I like the former, but I think you as an interpreter can do what you want with it. Throughout the first page, I encourage you to also darken the sound of the drum, maybe by going a little bit more towards the center, and then increasing the intensity of the accents compared to the unaccented notes. Let's try it without the mute and without the snares so that we can really hear the inadequacies of our technique, and then we'll try it with the mute and the snares. so on. So you might notice one interpretive challenge is that it's easy to get loud too fast. So I think as a performer, we need to try to pace it so that the crescendo in the first page is meaningful and it's audible. All right, now let's talk about measure 21 and 22. I love this moment in the piece because on the one hand, it sort of zooms in to sort of a virtuosic performance. And on the other hand, it sort of puts a period at the end of the first sentence of the piece in terms of how the rhythms flex, open, and close. So let's talk a little bit about how you might approach playing something like this. More generally, how you might approach playing something that's technically challenging. My approach would be to start with a mental representation, to start with an idea of what you think this should sound like before you start thinking about how you're going to do it. The how you're going to do it will support your sense of what it should sound like, but it doesn't create it. So here in the piece, as I mentioned, the story of the first page is this rhythm sort of flexing. On the one hand, the accents get closer and further apart. On the other hand, the space between the accents becomes sparser and more dense throughout the first page. So I think when we're approaching this measure 21 and 22, we want to highlight the density of the sound and also the density or the rhythmicity of the accents. So in terms of learning how to do this, I think we need an approach where the accents can be clear and we have pretty granular control over the dynamics and over the dynamics of the other notes. This actually aligns really well with how our bodies learn things. And I think as you're working on this section, you can apply some chunking, meaning breaking down this section, these two bars, into the component parts. So let's talk about developing a sticking. So there's a lot of different ways you can stick this section. You could single stroke it, which is hard to play fast. You could do double strokes and then triples when you get to the 9. So something like this. Something like that. My approach actually is to, every time there's an accent, to play that as a single stroke and then to play every other note as a double stroke. What I like about this is that it gives me control over my over the dynamic of the accent, which is something we determine is important interpretively here. And at the same time, it allows me to use my big muscles, my arms, to help support moving the music forward. So what I do is I play these the 30-second notes as inverted doubles. So I go. So instead of regular double strokes, I'm going. And then when I get to the 9s, I play those the same way, double strokes with an accented note as a single stroke. So put together, it sort of sounds like this. It may not be the easiest to play fast, but I think it does the story of the piece really well. So how might you practice something like that? My approach is to first make it easier, then make it much harder than it happens in the piece, and then bring it back to the piece. So to make this easier, let's eliminate the correspondence between the 30-second notes and the 9s, and let's just play 30-second notes. So we can just take the first 2 beats of 21 and the last 3 beats of 22 and play them as a unit. So slowly, it's kind of like this. Which broadly is similar to the beginning, right? That's cool. You might notice I'm playing louder than triple P. That's a great way to sort of get into the sound world of the piece. You can always reduce the volume later on. Then let's work on the 9s. One thing that's challenging about the 9 tuplets is that the accent's not on the first one. So let's just put it on the first one as we practice. Here, I would start to think about my stroke as coming not from my wrist, but maybe a little bit more from my arms. Let's experiment with that transition, which sets the bounds of your expression. It gives you a wide variety of things for you to choose from. So I'll start with my wrist, then I'll put it in my arms. kind of like the arm approach because it feels as though I'm moving a little bit more slowly. Now, let's make it harder than it occurs in the piece. And remember that all of this technical stuff is facilitated by having a really clear idea of what we want it to sound like. We're not wandering in the jungle, wondering if we're in the jungle. We're flying over the jungle in a helicopter and then maybe jumping out of it to do something cool. So here, let's try to make it harder. So we might make it harder by just extending each of these units. So instead of playing the piece as written, we might just play a lot of 30-second notes in a row, then a lot of 9s in a row. So maybe more like. Now let's try to play it really soft. Yeah, then let's try to put it back into the context of the piece. Already a little bit better. Another part of Start I find really powerful is the section beginning at measure 157. Broadly, I would call this a coda of the piece. It's basically when we as listeners realize the piece is going to end at some point, and we get even more sort of relentless, maniacal approach to the ending. So here in the music, hand gives us dynamics and accents and non-accented notes. But based on our experience working on the rest of the piece, I think it would be a shame to approach these in a very flat and static way. So my recommendation would be to approach these figures as melodies instead of just kind of two-height textures. So instead of what if it's da 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 da. So we're filling the space in between the accents with some kind of energy. Let's try that on the drum. Versus this. I think both are legitimate, but in my reading of the piece, which is that it's sort of a relentless development of this kind of melodic figure, this section is an extension of the rhythm of the beginning. And so I think it sort of suits this kind of melodic approach. Let's go a little bit deeper into sort of how we could approach this. We could try one beating spot and just sort of give a little bit of inflection to the accents. We could try something where we sort of straddle the snare bed and go in and out, having the drum be a little bit less focused and then more focused. In this case, maybe that's a little bit too much. We could try something where we alternate our hands. Or we could try something where everything's on the right. In addition, here, as the rest of the piece, I think the accents are less of a different sound than more of a different weight of sound. And if we approach the accents as a really snappy motion, to me, the color of those sounds is quite different. And I think here we should try to keep a more uniform color as we're inflecting the rhythm. So instead of, what if it's more? By the way, practicing without the snares on is a great way to sort of hear this in your playing. Let's try to put that into practice slowly. Kind of works. Now let's take a look formally at the different dynamics on this page. So at measure 157, we have forte, then we have fortissimo, and then we have piano subito. What if we approached each of these as a unit? So instead of a crescendo or staying flat, what if this first phrase at 157 had sort of a hairpin quality to it? And then that facilitates getting slightly louder when we get to the fortissimo subito. So those are some things that you can think about as you're working on trying to pace this part from the 157 to the end of the piece. One other really special feature of Start is the use of all these different implements when we play the piece. And instead of sort of walking you through bar by bar how I would approach using these implements, I think it's important for us as performers to think about a kind of, like I said, a mental representation or a sonic multi-parameter sense of what something should be like when it's right in the piece. And because our sort of framing of the work and our analysis of the work shows us that the function of these techniques is to highlight the structure, we want to be able to create a really specific color and a really specific articulation with each of the implements. So let's talk about how to do that. First, let's talk about our fingers. And in the course of the piece, we're going to use our hands, we're going to use our fingers, and then we're going to use our index fingers, and then we're going to need to use our thumbs. So as I mentioned earlier, the composer of this work has incredible calluses on their hands. And so when we play with our fingers here, this is at measure 35, let's try to create a finger sound that's not kind of floofy, but maybe a little bit more direct. Versus, since most of the piece is really rhythmically precise, it would seem strange to suddenly have a really unprecise moment. So I recommend, if you don't have really strong cello calluses or harp calluses on your hands, to press a little bit more here. Versus, likewise, later in the piece, when we have to play with our thumbs, we should try to create some meaningful difference here. So in the course of recording this piece, we settled on me using my knuckles in the section where it says to use our thumbs, which is kind of contrasting from this sound. So you can experiment with that, but essentially we want to try to create some contrast there. We want to play melodically, and we want the sound to be clear. So I'm basically playing dead strokes on each of these sections. And then finally, with our hands, with our whole hand at measure 33 and 34, I think something like that versus, or something that still has some pitch, but is just a darker sound quality is important. Now let's talk about the metal sticks. So the metal sticks occur at measure 138, and this is an augmentation. It's half as fast as the rhythm of the rest of the piece. And here we get a quite unusual marking from Han, dolce. So I interpreted that to mean that we should try to play with sort of a lilting through line. So instead of this, but maybe something longer. So for me, as an interpreter, I interpreted that to mean I should play on a part of the drum that rings, and a part of the drum that rings and helps sustain the sound a little bit. Likewise, because most chopsticks are not pitch matched at the factory, I found that alternating here has a tendency to highlight the difference between my hands more than the sameness of the melody. So I chose a sticking where my left hand is playing the accents, versus this. When I hear that, I just hear whoa, whoa, whoa. And likewise, I experimented with different parts of the drum head to create a sound that I think is the most melodic. Then when we get to this section with the thinnest sticks at measure 129 and similar sections, as I mentioned earlier, I use chopsticks for this, and I like it because it's really, 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 really contrasting with the drumstick that we use in the rest of the piece. It's a pretty big difference, and it's a much bigger difference than between using a really tiny beaded stick. Yes, I do hear a difference, but from 200 feet away, maybe not. So let's go back to the chopsticks. So here in the chopsticks, similar thing. We want to find a way of playing that highlights the crispness of the rhythm softly. So let's experiment with beating spot a little bit. I think here choosing something that really suits you could be is a great approach. You could also try pressing into the head. They don't say to do it, but they don't say not to do it. So I think all those things could be on the table when you play. Finally, the brushes. So in this piece, Han writes, use, for accents, let the handle of the brush hit the drum. So instead of, when we have an accent, we're going to play it like this. So if we just play accented, unaccented notes, okay, that's a little floofy compared to the rest of the piece. Yes, we need to play with brushes, but I do think here we need to keep that crispness of rhythm in order to highlight the hairpin that's happening. So what if we played a little bit more pressing into the head? So versus. Both work, but I think choosing something where the accent is clear. So now let's try with the handle. What I found here is that when I play with the handle of the brush on the accented notes, even at pianissimo, it's hard to play pianissimo. So what I do, and if you're a listening hand, don't listen to this part, is that I play with the handle of the brush as the accents get louder, and then allow the accents to be purely brush sound as we get softer. So the pianissimo. Something like that, which I think gives a nice nuance to the hairpins. Finally, with the brushes, there are marked tremolos, and what we settled on here was just really fast single strokes. That kind of thing, instead of a, I think that's a little bit less effective in this moment of the piece. Why? Because this is kind of the climax of the brush section, and to have a sound that's kind of hard to play loud versus I think is not an approach that I would take. It's an approach that you could take if you find that that's what is interesting to you in the structure of the piece. So with a piece like Start that has a lot of motivic repetition in it, I think it's important to talk about using a cheat sheet in your learning process. And in fact, this could work in almost any piece that you're learning. A cheat sheet is essentially you rewriting the text of the piece in your own shorthand. The other thing about using cheat sheets is that it reinforces multimodal learning. You're physically doing something that you are doing in a different way, and it also provides an opportunity to do a little bit of side-eye analysis. In order to rewrite the text of a piece shorter than the original piece, you need to have some sense of what the piece is about. So in my cheat sheet, I gave most of the main motives a letter, and then I talked about when they vary, I use like a plus or a minus, and I sort of give myself words to use for each of the sections. I recommend doing this. I use it when I perform the piece because it's visually simpler for me. I don't have to turn pages, and at the same time, it's just a little bit easier for me to look at. So one conclusion I would have is that it's really important to think one level up. In the case of this piece, the one level up is not the execution of the piece, it's the melodic nature of the piece that we want to highlight, and it's the form of the piece that we want to highlight. At the same time, what we did was we started big. We started with style, notions of this composer's style, the parameters that are important in their work, most broadly, and then we brought them to the text at hand, using those ideas to sort of imbue the text of the music with particular meaning. To me, that's interpretation, and there's a million ways you can do that as a performer. Finally, we took the idea that just because we are trained to do something a certain way does not mean we should do it that way in every circumstance. So most percussionists, and if you're a percussionist and you're watching, you might be an exception, which is great, are trained to play things really evenly. And evenness is the primary parameter. But in the case of a piece like Start, it really seems as though melodically inflecting the rhythms of the piece is more important than their evenness. So that's something also to keep in mind while you're approaching this piece.